Hello and welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Janice Meyer, the Community Engagement and Strategic Partnerships Senior Officer here at the University of Wisconsin-Superior, and it's a great honor to begin our series today with you. On behalf of the Link Center team here at UW-Superior, we are very excited to have Dr. John Barry to be the first presenter as a part of our speaker series, Bridging Civic and Public Health during pandemic times. Today's presentation will begin the series exploration of the intersections of public health, emergencies, citizenship, and leadership. Each speaker and topic will strategically build on each other's content to answer the question, how can we emerge from a public health emergency civically stronger together? Today, to kick off the series, Dr. Barry will be presenting what we can learn from history, the 1918 influenza pandemic. As you're listening, please take notes of any questions that you may have. After Dr. Barry's presentation, there will be time for questions that can be submitted through the chat box. I want to take a moment to thank our sponsors today. Today would not be possible without the generous support and sponsorship from the Tommy G. Thompson Center on Public Leadership. Thank you so much to the staff and the board at the Thompson Center for investing in this speaker series. And also I wanted to thank Eric and his team at the Wisconsin Institute for Public Policy and Service for their support and partnership. And so next, I would like to introduce Amber, UW-Superior's 2020 Campus Compact Newman Civic Fellow, and the Link Center's Community and Voter Engagement Intern. Thank you. Amber?
Thank you, Janice, and happy National Voter Registration Day, everyone. Celebrate by registering to vote today. And for those of you on campus, go pick up your Jackets Vote mask and informational flyer on campus every Tuesday from now until October 13th. As Janice was saying, my name is Amber Heidenreich, and I am a Voter Engagement Program Manager Intern with the Link Center here at UWS, and I am also UWS's Newman Civic Fellow. I am here to introduce today's speaker, Dr. John Barry. Dr. Barry is a prize-winning and New York Times best-selling author. The book he will be discussing with us today was named the year's most outstanding book on science or medicine by the National Academies of Sciences. Many experts within the fields he writes on have embraced his writings, which resulted in him becoming the first non-scientist ever to give the National Academy's Able Woman Distinguished Lecture back in 2006. He was also the only non-scientist on a federal government infectious disease board of experts. He has served on numerous other boards, including ones at MIT's Center for Engineering System Fundamentals, the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, and the Society of American Historians. He has also been the keynote speaker at events such as a White House conference on the Mississippi Delta and an international congress on respiratory viruses. He has also spoken at venues such as the National War College, the Council on Foreign Relations, and Harvard Business School. He is also the co-originator of the Bywater Institute at Tulane University. His articles have appeared in many journals such as Nature and Journal of Infectious Disease, as well as publications ranging from Sports Illustrated to Politico, the New York Times, the Washington Post, Fortune, Time, Newsweek, and Esquire. He is also a frequent guest on every broadcast network in the US, including NBC's Meet the Press, ABC's World News, and NPR's All Things Considered. He has also appeared on foreign media, including BBC and Al Jazeera. He has also served as a consultant for Sony Pictures and contributed to award-winning television documentaries. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I am pleased to introduce Dr. Barry.
Howdy. Thanks for that introduction. Thanks for inviting me to speak. Be hard to live up to that introduction, actually.
Dr. Barry, your volume isn't working right now.
Let's turn it up. It was working before, huh? But not now. Let me.
You seem to be good now.
Okay, well, I'll tell you what, I'll plug something in just to make sure. Okay, so much for rehearsals when everything works right. Anyway, obviously I'm going to talk about the 1918 pandemic and its relevance to today. The first thing to say about it is it killed between 50 and 100 million people. If you adjust for population, that would be equal to about 220 to 440 million people today. Thankfully, even the worst case projections for COVID-19 aren't talking about numbers anything like that. Fortunately, this virus is today is less lethal than the 1918 virus. Roughly 2/3 of the dead in 1918 were actually young people, aged between, or young to middle age, 18 to 45 years old. The peak age for death was 28. It also occurred in a remarkably short period of time. About 2/3 of the dead were killed in roughly about 14 or 15 weeks between late September 1918 and late December 1918. There was another wave that occurred in late winter, early spring 1919. To understand what happened, you really have to understand the context. The pandemic, and no disease occurs in a vacuum. In 1918, of course, we were at war. And that definitely affected the course of the disease, not in the sense that it spread it so much, although it did help accelerate the spread, but it would have gotten very much around the world, even if there had been no war. In 1698, an influenza pandemic managed to make it from Europe to North America, where it killed many Native Americans, obviously without steam travel. But because we were at war, probably more than at any other time in American history, the Woodrow Wilson administration was concerned about generating a very intense patriotism to help the war effort. Wilson had some legitimate concerns. Ireland had just rebelled against England, 1916, the Easter Uprising. There were a lot of Irish Americans. He was concerned whether or not they would fight on the side of the British. In addition, the largest single demographic group in the United States was German, so he was concerned whether German Americans would fight against Germany. So the administration pushed two things. First was something called the Sedition Act, which made it illegal, punishable by 20 years in jail, to, quote, utter, write, print, or publish any disloyal, profane, or scurrilous or abusive language about the former government of the United States. This act was quite rigorously enforced. In fact, Congressman from Wisconsin was sentenced to 10 years in prison, a congressman, under this act. And coordinating with this, the administration created something called the Four Minutemen, the Committee for Public Information, which was a propaganda arm. And the architect of that committee wrote explicitly, said, quote, "Truth and falsehood are arbitrary terms. There's nothing in experience that tells us one is superior to the other. All that matters is the impact of what you say." And this committee then recruited roughly 100,000 people. They called them 4 Minutemen, who before every public meeting, every school board meeting, every vaudeville show, every movie theater, they would get up and make a very brief speech. Not always exactly truthful. Sometimes outright lies, sometimes just twisted and spun a little bit to be favorable. So on the one hand, you have this propaganda arm, which would be an appropriate way to describe it, that was pushing less than an honest message. And on the other hand, you had this, then call that the carrot. On the other hand, you had what I would call a stick, this enforcement of anyone who questioned the government. Truth was not a defense if you criticize the government. As I said earlier, they rigorously enforced it. Many people were jailed under that act. The Supreme Court later upheld the act. A champion of free speech, Oliver Wendell Holmes, actually wrote the decision. And from that decision, a couple of phrases that still live today were included. One was, don't shout fire in a crowded theater. And the other one I've just forgotten. I'm trying to move on. I'm running out of time here. So that's the context when this virus appears essentially from nowhere. We don't know where the virus jumps species from animals. All influenza viruses are actually originate in birds, but they obviously can infect mammals. It actually could have been in the United States, possibly rural Kansas. It could have been in France. There's a hypothesis about France. It could have been in Vietnam. It could have been in China. It could have been in someplace else. But when, and incidentally, it was called Spanish influenza, not because it started in Spain. The one place we know it did not start was in Spain. But Spain was not at war, so its press was not censored. All the European countries that were fighting did censor their press. And the Spanish press wrote about it, so it became known as Spanish influenza. When the virus arrived in the United States in roughly the middle of September, this context I talked about was very important. Maybe the best example of that would have been Philadelphia, where everywhere around the country they had planned on September 28th a Liberty Loan parade to raise money for war bonds and help pay for the war. And in Philadelphia at that time, the virus was just beginning to take hold. And not every, but many public health leaders urged the city to cancel the parade. Many doctors wrote letters to editors and talked to reporters. Editors killed the stories. They wouldn't print any letters to the editor calling for the parade to be canceled. The parade went forward, and just like clockwork, influenza incubation periods 1 to 4 days. 2 to 3 days later, influenza just exploded in that city. And it became one of the hardest hit cities in the United States. Some of the symptoms of influenza in 1918, well, most people got an ordinary case that you're all familiar with, aches, fever, cough, and so forth. But in some people, it was much different. In some, they could actually bleed from not just their mouth or their nose, but actually from their eyes and ears. That's pretty terrifying. Some people were turning so dark blue from lack of oxygen, it's called cyanosis, that one doctor was writing a colleague that he couldn't tell white troops from African-American troops. And that, of course, spread rumors of the Black Death. And at the same time, the message that you were getting from the federal government was that this is nothing to worry about. They actually said this is ordinary influenza by another name. As I said earlier, it was called Spanish influenza. They say you have nothing to fear if proper precautions are taken. Things like this. The disconnect between reality and the messaging, to use Philadelphia again, for example, was so extreme that in Philadelphia, where at a time when the city was digging mass graves using steam shovels, at a time when priests were actually literally drawing horse-drawn carts through the streets, calling upon people to bring out their dead. just as it happened in the Middle Ages and the plagues. When they finally, belatedly, closed all schools, closed theaters, bars, restaurants, and so forth, one of the newspapers actually said, "This is not a public health measure. You have no cause for alarm." So the question is, how stupid did they think people are? You have more than 25% of the population getting sick. You see people dying sometimes in less than 24 hours. You see them dying with horrific symptoms, such as I described a few minutes ago. And you are being told when they close the schools and other businesses, it's not a public health measure. So the disconnect was such that people obviously no longer believed anything they were being told. I think ultimately society is based on trust. Without this level of trust, I think society begins to disintegrate. And in places around the country and the world where it was hardest hit, not everywhere, but in many places, society itself began to fray, to the extent that, again, to use Philly as an example, you have people starving to death, not because there's a lack of food, but because there's too much fear and nobody would bring someone food necessary to eat. The same thing was happening in rural areas. I remember I was wondering whether that was because it was urban and people were alienated a little bit. So I looked in rural areas where family and community was everything. And according to Red Cross reports, people actually starved to death in rural areas because even in one case, a woman's sister wouldn't carry food to a home where the entire family was sick and nobody could care for each other. So the impact of this, again, using Philly as an example, was, real panic. There was one doctor who lived 12 miles from his emergency hospital where he was working. And on his way home every night, he started counting the cars on the road because there were so few of them. And one night in the third largest city in the United States, in a drive of 12 miles, he did not see a single other car on the road. He said the life of the city has almost stopped. At almost exactly the same time, on the opposite side of the globe in Wellington, New Zealand, more than 10,000 miles away, another person is stepping outside his emergency hospital and looking and seeing absolutely nothing moving on the street except for an ambulance. He said Wellington has become a city of the dead. It got so bad that just at the peak, a gentleman named Victor Vaughan, who was before the war the dean of the University of Michigan Medical School, a very, very important figure in American medicine and its history. During the war, he became a colonel in the Army, head of its division of communicable diseases. This is a sober, serious guy, not somebody who overstates things. And he writes privately that if the current rate of acceleration continues for a few more weeks, civilization could easily disappear from the face of the earth. Now, fortunately, it did not disappear. Obviously, it did not. The rate of acceleration did not continue. We happened to write that right at the peak of the pandemic, and things did start to improve dramatically. Soon thereafter, the disease started to abate. But what are the lessons from all this? After the book came out, in just about the same time, a new virus called H5N1 was surfacing in Asia, particularly in Vietnam and China, that had roughly 60% case mortality, was infecting humans, another influenza virus, but it did not pass easily between people. Everybody was getting infected, was getting infected directly from birds. Was known as bird flu. At any rate, because of the threat of H5N1, the United States and pretty much every advanced nation in the world started to develop preparedness plans for another pandemic. I did get involved in that, and interestingly, Tommy Thompson, even when he was governor of Wisconsin, had gotten very interested in pandemic preparedness, chiefly because of an attorney who was his counsel named Stuart Simonson. Simonson is today, he's a very close friend. He's also Assistant Director General of the World Health Organization today. When Thompson became Secretary of Health and Human Services under George W. Bush, he carried with him both Simonson and the interest in pandemic influenza. And that really started quite seriously an effort by the federal government to generate a plan, a $3 billion bill in 2005. A lot of money went to research. It created the national stockpile, devoted a lot of money to vaccine technologies. And it also was trying to figure out, knowing that a vaccine for a new virus is not going to be available instantly, knowing that drugs were not going to be available instantly. They also launched an effort to try to figure out what you can do to mitigate the impact of a pandemic. I did get involved in that effort, and there were a couple of lessons, I think, that came out of the study of 1918. Two of them, really. The first was to tell the truth. That is written into the very top of the federal pandemic preparedness plan, and it's written into the top of all 50 states, all of which have pandemic preparedness plans, as well as the territories. The second thing is non-pharmaceutical interventions, so-called NPIs, which you have all heard more than you want to hear about. Obviously, social distancing, wash your hands, and so forth and so on. And a very detailed plan was developed, which sort of brings us to today. COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2 is the virus. COVID-19 is the disease. It's not influenza. There are a lot of similarities, however. First, it transmits almost exactly the same way, primarily through droplets, but also there is airborne transmission. The difference between droplets and airborne is really just the size of the particle. A droplet is going to carry enough moisture that it's heavy enough it will fall to the ground almost immediately. Airborne is a smaller particle, also produced when you breathe, talk, exhale, anything. And because it's a smaller particle and lighter, it will float in the air. It can travel a longer distance. Also, so-called fomites, that's a word for touch, like a doorknob. If you cough, open a door, someone else comes along after you, if you're infected, and they touch the door, then they rub their eyes, that can transmit. Although in COVID-19, that is not a main mode of transmission, but it can happen. So the mode of transmission is, as I said, virtually identical between COVID-19 and influenza. The pathology is also extraordinarily similar. We have discovered that SARS-CoV-2 can infect almost every organ. And very surprisingly, the 1918 influenza virus also could infect almost every organ. In fact, in 2005, when I was reading autopsy reports from victims of H5N1, I remember reading one which said, these findings have never been seen before in influenza. And I was thinking, well, this writer never read any of the pathology reports from 1918 because they were identical. So both COVID-19 and the 1918 virus and H5N1, or for that matter, could infect not only the lung, obviously the respiratory viruses, but the kidneys, the liver, the heart. Both SARS-CoV-2 and influenza definitely damage the heart muscle. There are a lot of neurological impacts from both of them. And, you know, as far as today, we know that even people who have absolutely no symptoms whatsoever never show the slightest indication of any impact of the virus. Nonetheless, we have discovered that their heart muscles are damaged, and their lungs are damaged enough that it will show up on a simple X-ray. We do not know whether this damage is long-lasting, what the long-term impact is, or whether it resolves fairly rapidly. And it's worth noting, in fact, that some of the complications from the 1918 virus did not show up at all until the 1920s. So you're talking about 5 to 10 years after the outbreak, before the longest lasting complications didn't even surface until then. So again, we don't know what's going to happen with COVID-19. What are the differences? Number one, the demographics. As I said earlier, the peak age for death in 1918 was 28. As you all know, right now, young people, it's very unusual for a death to occur among someone that age. Does happen. And again, we don't know what kind of long-term damage there may be to their heart or lung or another organ. But in terms of outright death, the overwhelming number of deaths are in the elderly for COVID-19. It was exactly the opposite in 1918. Another difference, of course, is the virulence. In 1918, everybody knew that this was a deadly disease. It was apparent in every household and every community because too many people were dying. Right now, in certain communities and certain demographics, age groups, and so forth, it is not at all so obvious that COVID-19 is as serious as it is. But perhaps one of the biggest differences that is actually putting more stress on society today than occurred in 1918 is that duration. The incubation period for COVID-19 is much, much longer, roughly triple, and sometimes 4 or 5 times as long as for influenza. You shed virus longer, you're sick longer, everything is stretched out. And in 1918, as bad as it was, at its worst, influenza came and went in any particular community roughly 6 to 10 weeks, and then it was gone. We are not facing that today. Even if we had not used non-pharmaceutical interventions to slow the spread of the virus and save people's lives, even if we hadn't done to pass through the community. Right now, we have already lived through a longer period than both the second and third waves of the 1918 and 1919 pandemic, and we're at best halfway through. Probably go on for quite a bit longer. And the fact that we have intervened has just stretched everything out that much more. By the same token, we've saved hundreds of thousands of lives in the United States itself by doing that. What you can do now, I would say, in terms of advice, you have heard it before. I don't have anything new to say. This disease does affect young people. It does damage your heart, even though you may not know it. It does damage your lungs, even though you may not know it. It may damage other organs, even though you have absolutely no symptoms whatsoever. Again, whether or not that damage will heal without any complications, or whether or not there will be long-term repercussions, we do not know. Obviously, we've only been living with this disease for 6 months. So it makes real sense to follow the advice that you're getting from public health leaders. And that is, you've heard it before, the most important thing is social distancing. That is number one, number two, and number three. If you're distant, the virus can't transmit. And frankly, 6 feet is not necessarily enough. Number two, the masking. And well, I'd say number two, avoiding crowds, which is also, of course, part of social distancing. Number three, the masks. The masks are not a magic potion. What they do is cut down your risk. They do not eliminate it. So don't get overconfident if you're wearing a mask. And wash your hands. Hand washing matters. All these things matters. And on that, I think just about looking at the clock, I've just about run out of time, and we'll take questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Berry. We'll now turn to some question and answers, and we're so grateful that you're taking the time to field some audience questions. My name is Eric Giordano, and I am the Executive Director of the Wisconsin Institute for Public Policy and Service, which is a unit of the University of Wisconsin system. And we're pleased to be partnering with the Link Center at UW-Superior and the Tommy Thompson Center to make this event available. So here's how the Q&A process will work. If you're watching live and you have a question for Dr. Berry, please type your question in the Facebook chat section. We've seen a couple already, which we'll get to in a moment. UW-Superior staff are standing by, and we'll select some of the questions that I will read to Dr. Berry. So let's jump right into it, Dr. Berry. The first question is from an audience member who asks, when you were researching and writing in the early 2000s, could you have imagined a future pandemic like the one we're currently in, when mayors, governors, and a president would react in ways like Philadelphia's city government and President Wilson reacted in 1918?
I certainly expected another pandemic. Anybody in public health knew it was only a question of when and how bad it would be. No one in public health expected a response such as we have gotten, which frankly is utterly incomprehensible. You know, as I said, written into the federal plan at the top is transparency, tell the truth. In those early meetings, I was at the very first meeting when we were conceptualizing the plan, and my message was tell the truth, and nobody really pushed back. It was pretty much unanimously adopted as a very important basic. The communication is key. And unfortunately, we didn't get it. We now know that on February 7th, Trump told Bob Woodward, this is deadly stuff. And he went on to say, you know, some people, you don't have a chance if you get infected. So he knew it was serious. And as a statement of fact, unfortunately, he went out and lied. And the result has been that we have not gotten the compliance, adherence to the public health recommendations, and we've got 200,000 dead Americans. And we would have a lot fewer dead if we had done a better job, as many other countries around the world, almost every country around the world has done a better job, unfortunately.
Thank you. We have another question from a viewer. Last November, when the news started coming out of Wuhan, China, the viewer wants to know, what was your initial reaction, and especially as it progressed towards a more communicable type disease?
Well, I didn't know anything except what I was reading in the newspapers at that stage. In fact, actually, if a lot of people watching may be too young to remember the 2009 pandemic, but I was getting emails from scientists in 2009 before there was any public notice of it whatsoever. So nobody knew anything until December 30th, although we now know the first cases were in November. But it looked pretty serious to me, and I actually wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post in January saying the working title for that op-ed was "This virus cannot be contained." It looked to me like it was going to be a pandemic. It was coming, and we better get ready for it. And it was middle of January when I wrote that, or actually immediately upon when China closed down Wuhan, then you knew how serious this was going to be. And even then, there was already rumors about asymptomatic transmission. So with that being the case, it had to spread around the world. There was not going to be any way of containing it. Wuhan's a city of 11 million people. So if I knew it just from what I knew about pandemics and from the newspapers, it is a great disappointment that our government did not respond more aggressively to it. The scientific community was responding.
Okay, thank you. Continuing on with another audience question. In the afterword from 2009, you tracked the pandemics of 1957, 1968, and 2009 H1N1, and you generally discuss wearing masks and school closings as interventions that could be controversial. Now, writing that in 2009, could you have imagined the scale of the debate and resistance surrounding such interventions today?
Well, no, and clearly it's because you're getting two different messages and it's become politicized. Why a public health guidance, which is unanimous among public health people, unanimous, has become politicized, it just doesn't make any sense. And why Trump chose to pick on masks, yeah. Again, unfortunate, and people have died and will continue to die because of it.
Okay, thank you. One viewer has a comment that we'd like to have you react to. He or she says, some respected medical people are saying that if some virus gets through the mask to the wearer, it may possibly boost immunity. Have you heard anything about this?
Yeah, that's the primary reason to wear a mask is to protect other people. Think of it as laws against drunk driving. People say, well, it's my body. Why can anybody tell me what to do? Well, they can tell you not to drink and drive because you might kill somebody else who's innocent. By the same token, the primary reason to wear a mask is to protect other people so you don't kill them. We had the wedding in Maine where nobody was masked, and 7 people have died, none of whom attended that wedding. At any rate, but even though the primary reason to wear a mask is to protect other people, it does in fact provide you with some protection because it does cut down on the amount of virus that gets through the mask that will expose you if someone's not wearing it, or actually even if they are wearing a mask, some virus could be possibly transmitted. And there is a theory that has a lot of substance to it, although it has not been absolutely demonstrated, that when you get exposed to the virus, the more virus you get exposed to, the more likely you are to get sick and seriously ill. Whereas you get exposed to just a little bit of virus, then if you get sick at all, you're going to be less sick. And it's possible your immune system can handle it and not make you sick at all, in which case it's almost like a vaccine. So the theory about wearing a mask is that if by cutting down the amount of virus load that penetrates and infects you, penetrates the mask and gets into your nose and mouth, or for that matter, eyes, although very few people wear face shields, then this lower viral load can excite your immune system and end up protecting you even if you don't develop the disease. As I said, it's got a lot of logic to it. It has not been clearly demonstrated, but I think that's what the questioner was asking about.
Yeah, thank you very much. Another audience member has written, they want to know, during your research on the 1918 pandemic, did you find that evidence that other countries had done better than the United States or better than each other in terms of their response and suggested mitigation strategies? And how does that mirror sort of what you're seeing today, where some countries are taking very different pathways to try to reduce or mitigate the spread?
Now, you didn't see the differentiation in 1918 that you see today based on response. However, in the developed world, the case mortality was probably only about 2 to 2.5%. In the less developed world, the case mortality was 6 to 8%, much, much higher. And the reason was not because of medical treatment, and it wasn't because of non-pharmaceutical interventions. The reason was, or at least this is my speculation, I can't prove it, but it makes sense. The reason was, in the developed world, people had seen other influenza viruses, and they actually had some modest cross protection from those other influenza viruses they had been exposed to. In other regions of the world where possibly they had never seen any influenza viruses, they were extremely vulnerable, and you got much higher case mortality. And in some areas, you saw 20 and 25% of the entire population dying from the disease. In both Alaska and in the middle of Africa, you see villages of several hundred people with 90 to 100% mortality. Now, that level of mortality was probably not exclusively because of the virus. It probably would have been because everybody got sick at exactly the same time, and no one could even bring water to somebody else. Plus the psychological impact of seeing everybody around you die. So there were differences, and sometimes dramatic differences, but it wasn't really because of the response.
Great, thank you. Speaking of Africa, another viewer is asking about Africa today. It seems this viewer has says that the impact or the deadly impact of COVID-19 has not seemed to be as large as predicted, and it could be because maybe they're not testing as much, or maybe there's some other reasons. And we'd like to have you comment on that.
Oh, that's correct. And I'm on an email chain with some public health people from around the world, including many people in Africa, who are pleasantly surprised, I mean, thrilled that it's not as bad. Plus, some of the country, with the exception of South Africa, where it is pretty bad. But not even places like Nigeria have done much better than expected. Foreign policy ranked the responses of, I think, 36 countries, and they actually ranked Senegal as the second best response in the world in terms of handling the disease, even though they have, compared to the United States, for example, practically no resources. They have 7 doctors per 100,000 people. We have 300. And yet their responses, the United States ranked 31st on that list, incidentally. Senegal was second. New Zealand was first. But there were a lot of predictions of a terrible tragedy in Africa. And so far, that has not played out, fortunately, and we're not really sure why. There's some speculation that it's a younger population and so forth, but I don't think there's really an adequate explanation at this point, that hopefully the numbers will stay where they are.
Okay, thank you. Another viewer is asking sort of about transitions, and I sort of wanted to have you draw a contrast or comparison between what happened in 1918 when the flu eventually subsided and society, let's take the United States, was transitioning out of that, how long that took, and how does that compare to what you think is happening today with COVID?
Well, it's what I was saying during the talk, that the duration, the stress of the length of time that we're having to put up with this, it's already much longer than 1918. In 1918, it came, it was horrible, but then it was gone. In some cities, a third wave came, but there was a distinct gap between that, and the third wave was much milder and was also of even shorter duration. And then that disappeared. And we're just having to deal with this day after day after day. So in terms of the transition out of this, you know, this virus is not going to go away ever. It's going to be a human disease forever, I think. We will develop drugs. It's also possible that after being exposed to it, our immune systems will naturally be able to deal with it much better. There are at least some virologists who have a theory. I'm not a virologist, but this is definitely a minority view. But they think the virus itself will mutate and become just like another common cold virus. Wouldn't that be nice? Incidentally, the difference between this coronavirus and the common cold is also the difference between the 1918 virus and so-called bird flu, H5N1, H7N9. This virus can bind to cells deep in your lung. Common cold viruses can't do that. It can also bind to cells in the upper respiratory tract, your nose, your mouth, and so forth, which makes it easily transmissible. The bird flu viruses can only bind to cells deep in your lung. So again, if you get sick at all, 60% case mortality with the SARS can only bind, well, another coronavirus, SARS can only bind to viruses deep in your lung. So you get really sick if you get sick at all. But it could not bind to cells in your upper respiratory tract, so it did not transmit easily from person to person.
Great. Thank you for that. I want to turn a little bit to a question about mental health. Mental health in the early part of last century was probably not so advanced, and we're a little more cognizant of the relationship between physical and mental health. But did you, in your research about the 1918 pandemic, come across any sort of thoughts or research around how people dealt with this from a mental health perspective, or how things have changed now that we know much more about mental health?
Not in my research, no, not really. We know that the virus itself had neurological, it was neurotropic, so-called. There was one scientist who, I think about 10 years ago, did a study wasn't looking at influenza, but was trying to associate World War I and suicide. And he discovered he couldn't really associate World War I and suicide, and yet he could associate the 1918 pandemic and suicide. So it clearly had impact, but as you say, the whole mental health profession, it's so radically different today that you can't really compare the two. And whether those suicides were actually related in a mechanical way to the virus, whether it was the virus infection or whether it was depression around other people in your family dying or so forth and so on, we don't know. We do know that the virus in 1918, just like COVID-19, did get into, whether it was the virus directly or whether it was toxins released by the immune system that had it, but there was a real mechanical impact, not just psychological, not just imaginary or mental. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, okay. Here's another question, and I know you did talk about takeaways in the concluding part of your talk, but are there any other innovations, I guess, or takeaways, silver linings maybe, that we learned from the pandemic of 1918 that we either were able to apply or that we should be applying now?
I wouldn't say it's that we're, well, and I guess we are applying in a sense. The 1918 pandemic gave a tremendous boost to scientific research, as this one is. You know, there was, I mean, they were great scientists in 1918. They didn't know what we know today, but they were wonderful scientists. We came out of that pandemic. It didn't happen for during the pandemic. It moved too fast. But after the pandemic, we learned that we defined exactly what a virus was. One of the main characters in my book, Oswald Avery, discovered that DNA carried the genetic code, developed because of his research on the virus, even though it doesn't seem directly related, but he launched the entire field of molecular biology, which is allowing us to make tremendous progress today. Right now, there's more scientific cooperation. There's more interdisciplinary work than probably there has ever been. And this is across laboratories, across campuses, across countries. And hopefully that will continue after this pandemic leaves us.
Thanks. Dr. Berry, we're kind of drawing to the conclusion here, but another interesting question is, you know, how did everyday citizens back in 1918 in the US approach things like family gatherings? I mean, we heard about your story about how the public press and some cases were, you know, encouraging people to gather. How are everyday people?
Well, there pretty much weren't any, I don't think. I didn't mean to cut you off. I know we're running out of time. You know, fear emptied the streets, and the virus got everywhere. You know, absentee, and you didn't have any work, sick leave in those days, and you got industries where we have good data from, where absenteeism was over 60%. You have anecdotal reports of places that were completely shut down. Coal miners, this isn't case mortality, this is mortality. In that age group, 18 to 45, more than 6% of miners died in a period of 3 and 4 weeks. So the mines basically shut down. You know, in terms of going to a wedding, I mean, most places ban public funerals. I didn't do a systematic study of every city in the country, but in pretty much every city I looked at, there were no funerals. People ran out of coffins. Every city in the country practically ran out of coffins. They were actually reusing coffins. They'd have the coffin for a ceremony, then bury someone and use the coffin for somebody else. So you weren't having weddings with large groups of guests. You were barely having funerals attended by immediate family. There was much more fear out there in 1918 than exists today, and frankly for good reason, because that virus was much deadlier.
Right. So just follow up on that. Partly, as you said, because there's maybe not as much fear, it's a little confusing, I think, for a lot of people to know how this pandemic we should be acting, right? We've already seen some people are, you know, frankly, not masking and not social distancing. So, and here we are upon the fall and moving into the holiday season where there are, you know, typical extended family and large gatherings. Do you have any suggestions or advice for us about how to best, you know, deal with this?
You know, I know if I were, you know, 20 years old, I would think that this virus was taking away part of my youth. And it is. And it is a incredible stress. And the longer it goes on, the greater that stress is. But I think the analogy that I used earlier of a drunk driver going out and killing somebody, you know, I think that should apply to somebody who's young today when they think about partying. Just be more responsible. just staying a smaller group, it's hard. And it's going to stay hard at least for several more months. So, you know, I'm over 70, so I'm vulnerable. So if you
Yeah.
like the talk, saved my life. If you didn't like it, I guess go out and party, whatever.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Berry. I appreciate you taking the time to answer the questions, and I'm going to turn the time back over to Janice Meyer. Thank you, Janice.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you again, Dr. Berry, just for your very informative talk and presentation. For everyone that's in the audience today and that were able to join us, thank you again for being with us today. We hope that you can join us again as a part of our speakers series on October 13th, again at noon, with Eric Liu, author of You Are More Powerful Than You Think, a citizen's guide to making change happen. And he will be presenting civic health and the future of our communities depends on it. And so again, mark your calendar. We will again be on here at Facebook Live, and you could register with us on campus at uwsuperior.edu through our CVent. So again, thank you, Dr. Berry. Thank you for everyone that was in attendance. And for those of you that are going to stay on for the Q&A, we will begin that at 2 o'clock today, and we'll see you then. Thank you very much.
Thank you.